On March 12, 2026, Highguard will be shut down forever. Its servers will go offline, the matches will stop, and within a few months, most people will probably forget it ever existed. Now, I'm going to say something controversial here. I like Highguard. Now, I know the overwhelmingly popular opinion is that this game is the second coming of Concord, and look, I understand why people feel that way. Highguard absolutely has its problems. But after spending time with it, platinum time, I can't shake the feeling that the game has been a little mistreated. The best way I can describe Highguard is that it feels like a house built on an incredibly strong foundation. The soil is fertile, the materials are high quality, the floor plan is wide open, the kind of layout that would make HGTV enthusiasts blush. The curb appeal is impossible to deny. On paper, it's the dream home. But the moment you actually lay eyes on it, things start to feel off. The outside of the house is covered in thousands of perfectly placed bricks. Structurally, it's flawless. But each brick is painted a different color, making the whole thing look like it was designed by a Skittle-addicted schizophrenic. You walk inside and notice the floors are made from genuine maple wood. Beautiful, expensive stuff. But none of the planks line up with the walls, leaving awkward gaps where you can see the concrete foundation throughout the entirety of the home. The kitchen is massive. There's a gorgeous island in the center, plenty of room to cook and entertain. But the backsplash is celadon green, and above the dining area in gigantic bold letters, someone has painted, "Live, laugh, love." At this point, you're already concerned, but you push forward into the living room and discover something even worse. Shag carpet on the floor in 2026. You want to love this house. Everything about its construction suggests that you should, but it keeps giving you reasons not to. And it certainly doesn't help that everyone has been telling you the place is haunted and you'd have to be a complete fool to even consider living there. What I'm getting at with this admittingly obnoxious house analogy is that Highguard is a well-made product, plagued by some very questionable design decisions. And I truly believe that with just a few renovations, this could have been something great. I had already planned to make a video about Highguard, and with the recent news of the game's closure, I felt motivated to get this out sooner. So, as the title says, this is a review of the game, but I also want it to serve as sort of a time capsule. With the servers going offline, Highguard will soon fade into memory. And I think it's important to document what it was before it disappears. So, whether you're watching this now or years from now, welcome to Highguard.
Welcome to Highguard.
To understand the story of Highguard, you first have to understand the people behind it. That story begins on December 3rd, 2021, when Chad Grenier announced he was leaving Respawn Entertainment, the studio behind the Titanfall series, Apex Legends, and the modern Star Wars Jedi games. His career in the industry stretches all the way back to the original Call of Duty, where he worked as a game designer at the legendary developer Infinity Ward during what many consider the studio's golden era. After the release of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 in 2009, Grenier was recruited to the newly founded Respawn by Vince Zampella and Jason West. There, he worked in design on both Titanfall games before eventually being promoted to lead scripter for Apex Legends. It's pretty obvious that the guy has quite the resume, so when he announced he was leaving the studio, expectations were immediately high. Over the next 2 years, Grenier quietly assembled a team made up of former Respawn developers, along with talent from across the industry, to form Wildlight Entertainment. Key members of Wildlight include co-founder Dusty Welch, designer and creative director Jason McCord, head of studio culture and operations Alicia Aluni, and VP of product publishing Jason Torfin. Go ahead and take a look at the games these people have worked on. Who wouldn't be excited about what they might be building? After 2 years of assembling this team largely behind the scenes, Grenier returned to the public eye with the official announcement of Wildlight on February 16th, 2023. In his announcement on Twitter, or X, you could genuinely feel the excitement about what the team was working on. And then the studio went quiet again. For nearly 3 years, there were no major reveals, no gameplay, and almost no information about what Wildlight was doing. Well, that was until December 11th, 2025, when the Game Awards closed the night with the reveal of Highguard, and immediately everything went wrong. It's actually a bit of a mystery how games are selected to fill the announcement slots at the Game Awards. Based on the information I was able to find, developers and publishers often pay a very high price just to appear during the show. A report from Kotaku last year suggested that these placements can cost upwards of $1 million per minute. So how are these reveals actually organized? Apparently much of that responsibility falls to the show's host and producer, Jeff Keighley. But the exact details behind those decisions are never made public. We don't really know why certain games appear where they do. Did one publisher pay more than the other? Does Jeff personally encourage certain reveals to maximize viewership? In the end, it's all speculation, which makes one particular decision even more interesting. How exactly did Highguard end up as the final announcement of the 2025 Game Awards? Being placed at the very end of the show guarantees attention, but it also raises expectations to an incredibly high level. After all, some of the show's previous closing reveals have included Naughty Dog's Intergalactic, The Heretic Prophet, Monster Hunter Wilds, the next Mass Effect, and the release date trailer of Final Fantasy XVI. Based on the way that Jeff was hyping up the reveal, gamers were expecting something else incredible. The Witcher 4 gameplay reveal, a release date trailer for Judas. Rumors were even floating that the infamous Half-Life 3 might finally grace us with its presence. What we got instead was the announcement of yet another hero shooter, and easily the most saturated market in the industry. Even I, a fan of this genre, felt incredible disappointment before I even saw a second of gameplay. Cut forward just a few seconds into the future, and the reveal of the first playable character left the audience staring back at their screen with something closer to confusion or outright disgust. Whatever momentum Jeff created immediately disappeared. The win wasn't just taken from the sails, no. The ship underwent a full-scale pirate boarding, which left the vessel in absolute shambles. And then after the ship sank down to the bottom of the ocean, Poseidon himself came down and smited the remains for even having the audacity to grace his waters. And right there, only a few seconds in, it was already over for Highguard. Now, is it completely fair to discount the quality of a game based on a few seconds of an announcement trailer? No, of course not. But in this day and age, especially with multiplayer exclusive games, getting the announcement right is so incredibly important. Gamers are already sick of seeing these games announced to them in a passive manner. What do you think the reaction will be when one is revealed in the last and final slot at the biggest gaming event of the year? In my 28 years alive, I have never seen a game receive so much hate so quickly. In minutes, the internet began to tear Highguard apart, hailing it as Concord 2.0. Even though I do not agree with the sheer level of backlash that Wildlight and Jeff received, I have to admit that some of the memes that came out of this incident are quite hilarious. Genuinely, some of the best stuff I have seen. Still, I can only imagine how this could have affected the people at Wildlight. Behind the scenes, I'm guessing they thought they were doing it all right. They had assembled a fantastic team. The game was essentially finished with a release date of only 8 weeks away, and Jeff Keighley himself personally wanted to put it at the end of his show. From their perspective, how could this possibly go wrong? After the reveal, Wildlight went completely dark in attempts not to make the situation worse, but it almost seemed like their silence did the opposite. Everyone and their mom was obsessed with hating this game. Some people even argued that this was actually good for Highguard. After all, everyone was paying attention. On the launch day of January 26, 2026, they had just under 100,000 people try the game on Steam, plus the additional amount that played it on consoles. More than enough players than needed to make a profit. So why didn't they stay? Was Highguard as bad as everyone thought it was going to be? Let's talk about it. Well, at some point we have to stop standing out on the street, listening to rumors about the haunted house, and actually step inside. Because the truth is that much of the outrage surrounding Highguard had very little to do with the game itself. It was about the reveal, the characters, the timing, and the internet doing what the internet does best. But none of that tells us whether the house was actually built well. To answer that, we need to take a closer look at the core mechanics of Highguard: the movement, the gunplay, and the systems that make up the moment-to-moment gameplay. To explain it briefly, Highguard is another free-to-play hero shooter that, shockingly, plays a lot like Apex Legends. It also features mechanics from Battle Royales, Rainbow Six Siege, MOBAs, and popular Call of Duty modes. Somehow, it manages to compile all of these influences into a multiplayer experience that, when everything is working correctly, is actually a lot of fun to play. The game's main mode, Raid, pits 2 teams of 3 players against each other. Each player chooses their preferred warden, all of whom have their own unique passives, abilities, and ultimate, just like in Apex. While some of the warden's designs are quite generic, especially Atticus, they are nowhere near as bad as what we saw in Concord. In fact, there were a few I genuinely enjoyed, like Icon, the first post-launch warden who can transform into a wolf. After selecting a warden, players can vote on a preferred home base. Each offers different advantages and disadvantages and can best be described as small to medium Call of Duty maps. Home bases consist of 3 generators, 2 small and 1 large, which serve as the primary objective of the match. Their exact purpose will be explained a little later on in the video. When the match begins, players are given a short window to swap loadouts and reinforce their base walls. Once the base dome clears, teams are free to venture out on their trusty steeds into the full-scale map to explore, gather loot, and begin hunting each other down. The overall map structure is very similar to a traditional MOBA. Each team's base sits on opposing sides of the map, with the rest of the environment shared evenly between them. At launch, Highguard featured 5 full-scale maps, each with its own biome, unique locations, and different level design. Overall, these maps are very well crafted, but with only 6 players running around, there are long stretches of time where very little combat actually happens. Once players leave the base, a 2-minute timer begins. This phase is dedicated to gathering better weapons and gear or mining a currency known as Vesper. Vesper is a blue crystal scattered across the map that can be harvested and spent at vendors to purchase equipment. Mining Vesper isn't mandatory, but it can be very helpful during respawns when you want to quickly buy something useful. Your starting loadout, meanwhile, becomes almost immediately irrelevant. The moment you start opening crates around the map, you'll begin finding better weapons. Gear follows the familiar color-coded rarity system: white, blue, purple, and orange, with higher tier loot appearing later in the match. Other equipment includes armor, helmets, amulets that grant passive buffs like faster ability cooldowns or quicker bomb plants, and special raid weapons that help players navigate the map or break through enemy base walls. During this phase, players are free to fight each other if they happen to cross paths. However, winning these fights doesn't necessarily provide much advantage, since the loot you gather is permanently tied to your inventory. And with unlimited lives and relatively short respawn times, you'll be back in the action quickly. After the 2-minute timer ends, a powerful item called the Stormbreaker emerges to form at a random point between both bases, with 1-minute countdown starting shortly after. This is where the game actually started to shine for me. When the timer reaches 0, the Stormbreaker becomes active, allowing any player to pull it from its stone. At that moment, the game shifts from a MOBA/Battle Royale into a game of capture the flag, but with a twist. The objective is simple: grab the Stormbreaker and deliver it to the enemy base to initiate the raid. This phase often produced some of the most exhilarating moments in the entire match, as teams fought desperately over possession of the sword. While the Stormbreaker sometimes appears in open areas of the map, it is most commonly located within smaller sub-locations scattered across the landscape. These act as Highguard's more focused multiplayer arenas, and they're expertly crafted. Mounts cannot enter these areas, and dying inside them can be extremely costly. Matches become even more intense if the fights drag out long enough to trigger overtime. During overtime, respawns are temporarily disabled, meaning a single death can determine who will obtain the Stormbreaker. Once the Stormbreaker is successfully delivered to an enemy base or one team is wiped in overtime, the final phase begins, the raid. I do want to highlight that planting the Stormbreaker is always a satisfying animation, and watching the siege tower phase into the map never gets old. During this phase, the attacking team has a limited amount of time and lives to destroy the enemy base's generators. The objective is to decrease your opponent's base health to 0. How you accomplish this is up to you. Destroying one of the smaller generators removes 35 points from the base's health, while the larger generator, known as the Anchor Stone, removes 70 points, which results in an instant victory. Since planting the Stormbreaker already deducts 30 points from the enemy's health, the attacking team must decide whether to split their focus across multiple objectives or attempt to destroy the Anchor Stone outright and win the game. Smaller generators take about 30 seconds to destroy, while the Anchor Stone takes 60 seconds. A successful raid depends heavily on communication and coordinated teamwork. Pulling off a first raid victory by destroying the Anchor Stone is incredibly satisfying. If the defending team manages to repel the attackers without losing any generators, the attacking team also loses 30 points. While this rule doesn't entirely make sense from a design perspective, it likely exists to shorten the overall match length. Games can last anywhere from 8 minutes to over 30, depending on how evenly matched the teams are. Some of my most memorable matches went back and forth repeatedly, with the final Stormbreaker or raid becoming an incredibly tense but genuinely fun experience. Okay, Micah, you've explained to us how Concord 2.0 works, but how does it feel to play? Guys, this is where Highguard genuinely shines. The weapons are punchy, responsive, and satisfying in a way that will feel very familiar to anyone who has spent time with Apex or Titanfall. Shots land with a noticeable sense of weight, recoil feels predictable, and the overall time to kill strikes a nice balance between being lethal and giving players a chance to react. Simply put, the moment-to-moment shooting in Highguard feels good, and in a multiplayer game, that's half the battle. Movement is another area where the developer Respawn's background really shows. Traversing the map on horseback adds a unique layer of mobility that helps the larger environments feel manageable, while the on-foot movement feels quick and fluid during combat encounters. Trust me, you're going to be sliding all over this map. Abilities, vertical positioning, and the smaller combat arenas around the Stormbreaker all combine to create fights that can feel dynamic and unpredictable. When players actually collide in these moments, Highguard can be a lot of fun to play. On a mechanical level, Highguard actually has quite a bit going for it. The shooting feels responsive, movement is fast and satisfying, and the different phases of a match can lead to some genuinely intense moments. And yet, for most players, those moments weren't enough to keep them around for long, which raises the obvious question: what exactly went wrong? The answer, at least in my opinion, comes down to a handful of design decisions that held Highguard back from being the game it probably could have been. None of these issues is catastrophic on its own, but together they create a snowball effect that quickly builds up into an avalanche, pushing players away instead of pulling them in. Simply put, Highguard gets some of the big things right and a lot of the small things wrong. The first issue becomes obvious just by looking at the game. There is something inherently unappealing about the mix of high fantasy, sci-fi technology, and modern firearms like AK-47s. None of these art styles blend together in a cohesive manner. In fact, I would argue that this is certainly Highguard's biggest issue. There is nothing really interesting or distinctive about the art direction overall in the game, and because of this, it fails to establish a clear identity. If I were giving feedback to the developers, I would have suggested focusing on one of these styles and committing to it, preferably the one with steampunk elements that occasionally appear throughout the game. Narrowing the aesthetic down would have created a much stronger visual identity and helped Highguard stand out in an already crowded genre. This problem becomes even more noticeable when you look at the Warden characters. Their designs pull from completely different artistic directions, which makes the roster feel less like a cohesive cast and more like a collection of unrelated concepts. Many of them look like they belong in entirely different games. The art direction had always been a problem with me, and after putting in some hours into the recently launched Marathon, it only exacerbated these issues. Also, the literal name of the game, Highguard, is awful. What does that even mean? In retrospect, it's strangely perfect. A mashup of things that don't seem to belong together at all. Yeah, that pretty much sums up Highguard. And in the same way, the gameplay itself is a mix of familiar ideas, some executed well, some less so. While I praise the gunplay, movement, and character abilities, most of the gameplay problems actually lie in the overall design. The 3v3 format was the wrong choice. The maps themselves are well crafted, but with only 6 players, they often felt empty and underutilized. This issue was somewhat alleviated when Wildlight added a 5v5 mode, creating more opportunities for combat to flourish. The problem with this update was that raid mode had now become overcrowded. In trying to fix one issue, they inadvertently created another, a classic Ouroboros problem where the solution feeds back into the problem itself. Home bases needed to be increased in size to accommodate the extra players, but doing so would have required an incredible amount of time and effort from Wildlight. The developers clearly wanted the raids to feel like all-out wars, but did they forget that most wars involve a lot more people actually fighting? Diving further into the home bases, there's not much players can do to actually increase the defenses. Wall fortifiers and repairs can be obtained out in the world or purchased from the vendor, but after that, there's very little room for creativity or strategy. No traps, no super fortifiers, no cannons or sentries, nothing. It quickly becomes clear that the defensive aspect of the game is underdeveloped. Shocking, right? This leaves much of the raid's intensity reliant on raw combat rather than clever planning. And this problem doesn't stop at base defenses. Loot in the game suffers from a similar lack of meaningful choice. Unless you stumble across a legendary weapon, there's little sense of progression during a match. Players may open crate after crate, yet feel almost no tangible improvement, making the core gameplay loop feel less engaging than it should. Do you prefer the blue AK-47 or the purple AK-47? When the first 2 minutes of every round are devoted to this mechanic, yet players don't feel like they're acquiring anything truly better, that's a problem. Especially when the vendor, scattered across the map, offers nothing unique and isn't even required to succeed in the game. Yet another underutilized mechanic. They should have taken more inspiration from MOBAs and added alternative ways for players to grow stronger or find loot during a match. With the maps being so well designed, hidden secrets, whether powerful weapons or abilities, could have added a real sense of discovery and strategy, elevating the gameplay beyond simple loot collection. Imagine powerful neutral bosses scattered across the maps. Defeat one, and instead of just gaining loot, you could recruit it to your side. That boss could then assist your team during the raid, introducing strategic options and adding layers of depth to each match. This would make every encounter feel meaningful and give players more agency instead of relying almost entirely on random loot drops. And I know someone out there has been yelling at their screen saying, "But Micah, what about the care packages in Highguard that drop legendary loot and the best gun in the freaking game, the big rig?" Oh, who am I kidding? No one said that. Nobody said that. No one's defending this game. It's literally just me. Nobody else. Oh, Highguard, bless your little underdeveloped heart. All you have is me. And I don't even like you that much. But the problems don't stop here. Progression in Highguard is shallow and underwhelming. Cosmetic rewards are sparse, and the menus make it difficult to even track what you've earned. Without a satisfying sense of growth from match to match, there's little reason for players to stick around once the initial novelty fades. Wildlight did attempt to address many of these problems with new modes and updates to the maps, but by the time they arrived, the damage had already been done. Highguard had the foundation for something great. Excellent gunplay, solid maps, and genuinely creative ideas. But without a stronger sense of identity and a more meaningful gameplay loop, it struggled to keep players invested. And that's the truth of it. Even with its flaws, the game deserves to be remembered. Because underneath all these issues, there truly is a great game buried in there somewhere. I honestly feel lucky to have played it. I just hope that one day someone takes these foundations in and nails it. So that's Highguard, a game that was judged harshly and ultimately failed to overcome it. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to explore this strange little haunted house with me. Please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting down below. I'd love to hear what you think about Highguard, or if you are one of the few people who actually played it before it disappeared. And one last message to the team at Wildlight. If for some reason you're watching this, you didn't deserve the hate, and I truly wish you guys all the best. For now though, it's time to turn off the lights, close the door, and leave this house behind.